Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our talk about disinformation, why we fall for it, and how we build immunity. In the next hour, we will present you the interesting viewpoints of our two guests. Marina Weisman, she will be online from Münster, and Richard Rogers, he will be on the stage here. After a short presentation, they will discuss how we can strengthen our democracy and deal with disinformation. There will be also time for questions from the audience at the end. And we have all seen these days that it's an urgent and relevant topic with far-reaching consequences. This talk was originally scheduled for the 2nd of November, because the next day we had organized a conference for teachers on dealing with disinformation in the classroom. We had to postpone the talk because of the storm on the 2nd of November, maybe you remember. But the teachers' conference took place, and there the violence in Israel and Gaza and how it affected the classroom was one of the main concerns. But today we will focus on the influence of Russian disinformation in Germany, the Netherlands, and Eastern European countries. With elections in the Netherlands tomorrow, I'm very pleased that we have Richard Rogers as our guest, because he has monitored the influence of disinformation in the Dutch election campaigns of 2019. Richard Rogers is a professor of new media and digital culture here in the Department of Media Studies at the Universiteit van Amsterdam. He's director of the Digital Methods Initiative that develops software tools for the study of online data. And Richard has published several studies, both as an author and as an editor, amongst which the propagation of misinformation in social media. Richard, please come to the stage. Marina Weisman will be, she's here, but she's not on screen because of the presentation of Richard, and I will introduce her later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wiebke. Thanks for the kind invitation to this evening. Thanks to you all for coming, and also on the live stream. What I'm going to do briefly is talk about the so-called disinformation problem in the Dutch political, online, especially social media space. And I'll do so on the basis of a study that was commissioned by the Ministry of Internal Affairs a couple of years ago, when we had two elections here in the Netherlands in 2019, the European elections, as well as the elections for the provincial states. For those of you who would like to sort of see this presentation later, you can also just take a picture. There's a URL up there. That's where this presentation can be found. Okay, so I want to start with this graphic. This is, in some ways, the birth of the fake news problem, and I say fake news with quotation marks. It was a 2016 study by Craig Silverman of BuzzFeed News, where he actually sort of coined or recoined this term, fake news. Quite infamously, it was found in the run-up to the 2016 U.S. elections that elected Donald Trump as the U.S. president. In the few months just before the elections, what Silverman called fake news outperformed mainstream news on Facebook. It had more engagement. So this is the famous graphic. It's the kind of the beginning of it all. But what's interesting about it is it also includes a method behind this particular study. So what I'll show you in a minute is how we reproduced the same method, and we did this exactly the same study for the Netherlands some years later. But first, prior to that study, there was this one. This was before the last national elections in 2017. This is a study by the NRC Handelsblad, who also redid Silverman's method, looking at basically querying a number of the names of the fractievoorzitters, the party leaders, and some social issues, and then looking at the most engaged with posts on Facebook. And what they found is that actually there wasn't really a fake news problem in the Netherlands. So this was the first time that this was done here. However, in the run-up to the 2019 elections, and after also a couple of other elections, one set of elections in Sweden, another one in Germany, another one in France, people started getting a little bit nervous about the prospect of Russian disinformation, in particular in the Netherlands. There were two incidents, one around the terrorist bombing at the Zaventem airport in Brussels, and secondly around the Ukraine referendum, EU affiliation referendum, also around the takeover of Crimea by the Russians. So around those events, there was found to be some Russian disinformation in the Dutch language, both in the Netherlands, in the sort of the Dutch social media space, as well as the Belgian social media space. So this is, in some sense, a kind of warning shot where the Ministry of Internal Affairs became kind of nervous about what could happen in the 2019 elections. So we were asked to answer this question: to what extent do foreign disinformation, so-called fake news, resonate in social media? So this is Dutch language social media in the run-up to these two elections in 2019. And so I'll go into this very briefly, and then I'll bring you up to the current situation now. So what I want to mention is the Silverman method of this sort of quote-unquote fake news. And it's an interesting definitional move. When you look into it in some detail, what Silverman called fake news included these sort of four types of content. One, disinformation. And what's interesting about disinformation is this is sort of false information, but with harmful intent. And it's oftentimes served quite factually. So the style is a sort of high level of facticity. So this is one type. Conspiracy theories. This is a very, very different type of sort of quote-unquote fake news. Has a lot of plot entanglements, a lot of actors. Front group campaigning. These are sort of fake organizations. So organizations pretending to be news organizations or pretending to be non-governmental organizations. But the most important one, and this is the one that has become the most controversial, is this notion of the hyperpartisan. The term hyperpartisan was coined by a New York Times journalist in mid-2016 to capture what that journalist called ideological web operations, highly ideological web operations. These were sort of fly-by-night sort of websites and or social media pages, Facebook pages in particular, which would be considered sort of extreme voices, not extremist, but extreme, with highly ideological viewpoints. Now, this is an interesting move because later, as it turns out, first the NRC Handelsblad, what I showed you previously, and then subsequently other parties, including Facebook, tried to redefine fake news and remove the hyperpartisan from it. They called, both the NRC Handelsblad journalists as well as Facebook and some others used the term false news. And the reason being that fake news became this sort of, was being mobilized by populist politicians. I mean, you saw it with Trump, you saw it with Bolsonaro, you saw it elsewhere, where they would accuse news organizations of being fake news. You are fake news. You are fake news. And so this particular term became quite controversial. And was a bit of a hot potato. You didn't want to really use it any longer. And you'll see that in our study as well. So what we did is we instead called it junk news. And so this was a term that was coined by the internet researchers at the Oxford Internet Institute. And it's an interesting term because it connotes unhealthy information consumption, sort of like junk food, junk news. And so we tended to use this term, and maybe it wasn't the best choice of words, and I'll get to that in a second. But in any case, what we did was we used existing source lists that were made made for a different purpose by some Belgian researchers that characterized news sources or online sources more generally in the Dutch language as being problematic or non-problematic junk or non-junk mainstream or junk like this. And so then we looked into this a little bit more deeply, and we decided to perform what we called a genre analysis. So we took the original definition of Silverman and then characterized sources according to those genres. So is it disinformation? And we're looking particularly at the style of the information. So as I mentioned briefly previously. And then we queried a number of platforms. So these are the platforms that we looked at. We looked at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Google Web Search. We looked at 4chan. We looked at Reddit. So all of these platforms, and we queried all of them, and then took the most engaged with posts from them, and looked and characterized whether they were sort of junk news or mainstream. And so what I'll just show you briefly is the Facebook work. So I've showed you this. So we wanted to reproduce what Silverman did. So this was the Silverman's output, and this was ours. So you see, in the run-up to the provincial status, or the provincial states elections, that mainstream news outperformed junk news. Right? So, and by quite a significant margin. So this was the first one, and then for the other one, European Union elections, the same. So again, we didn't have the sort of the fake news problem that the U.S. had in the run-up to the 2016 elections in the U.S. In 2019, we didn't have it. So this is the method. If for those of you who are interested in it, if you want to redo it, I actually was called just the other day by the NRC Handelsblad saying, "Have you done this study for the upcoming elections?" I said, "No, but you can do it. This is how you do it." But in any case. However, when you look, and I'm not going to zoom in on these for you, but when you look at individual politicians, individual issues, for some politicians and for some issues at particular periods in time, you did have quote-unquote junk news outperforming mainstream news. So it wasn't a completely rosy picture. But what we found most significantly and reported to the minister was that we found no foreign disinformation, no fake NGOs or front organizations. We found no fake newspapers. So in that sense, the Dutch political social media landscape was quite healthy. The mainstream news outperformed the junk news, but the hyper-partisan was the best performing. And this is where it gets interesting, or where it gets political, because the majority of the hyper-partisan is on the right of the political spectrum. So basically, you had a sort of right-wing media ecosystem of hyper-partisan sources sort of driving what you could call, at that point, a sort of relatively minor junk news problem. However, the amount of it had increased since the NRC Handelsblad study, and I bet if you did it today, it will have increased still. So I won't go through all of the findings. I just gave you the ones from Facebook, but it's interesting that a few of the other social media platforms have different kinds of problems for the sort of Dutch information landscape. I think there is an issue of hyperpartisan sources on the right. They are quite dominant in a number of places. They're dominant on Twitter. They're dominant on YouTube. If you look at the trending topics right now on X, Twitter, you'll see what's that the right-wing parties are trending, in particular Wilders. The other thing that we found, and this was kind of interesting for us, is that there are issues that are tense year-round. So they're not just tense during the election, and these are these cultural war type issues. So like Zwarte Piet, climate change, the EU, things like this, Europe. These are sort of issues where you get a lot of hyper-partisan engagement, especially from the right. We also found that the Dutch 4chan is is quite extremist. That there's a lot of extremist content there. Okay. So what we had to do as well is we had to formulate policy recommendations, and we formulated a number of them, and these had to do with media training, particularly for journalists and this was about the non-amplification of hyper-partisan information. So, and also not necessarily discussing in the news, this is what we put forward, how fascinating these sort of alternative, quite extreme or extremist, depending where you subcultures online are. So we had a couple of these sorts of things. We also talked about the idea of sort of, well, it's a very long tradition of the brede maatschappelijke debat, sort of these social debate traditions in the Netherlands, and how these might be brought back into play for these issues that do not go away, that they're heated year round, like Zwarte Piet and the rest. We also talked about monitoring the ever increasing polarization of the Dutch media landscape. So these sorts of things, they seem quite generic or maybe obvious even, but we were attacked. We were attacked massively. We were trolled on Twitter. This study in itself was brought out because we found not a foreign disinformation problem, but we found a domestic and internal hyperpartisan, right-wing hyperpartisan information problem in the Netherlands. This study, because of that controversial finding, was brought out on a Friday afternoon just before a holiday weekend by the government to attract as less attention as possible. And it did attract very little press attention, but it attracted a lot of social media attention where we were targeted. Especially on Twitter. And so in some ways, our study was a sort of self-exemplification. It exemplified precisely the problem, or the reaction to our study exemplified and amplified the problem that we had identified. So one of the things that we took away was that we need to address the quote-unquote fake news problem or junk news problem, or the problem was one of the problems was how you call it. This was one of the major issues, and maybe we can talk about that in a little bit. This is the book that we brought out, just so you know it. We're in Spouw 25. There are a lot of books around, so I wanted to put a book on screen. But I want to close by saying that there was one other slide that I wanted to show you, but it's from the NRC Handelsblad, and they have a rubric or a section called Nepnieuws. And the last article that they added to this section of the newspaper was in 2020. So you see that this term, first of all, has declined in interest. I think it's been, in some sense, dropped by the journalists, but the problem remains. And this is the dilemma that I would like to leave you with. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. A lot to discuss, I think. But next we go to Marina Weisband. She is a psychologist and participation editor born in Ukraine. She founded the Aula project, a tool for democratic participation in schools. And, she will need a laptop. 10 years ago, she was the spokesperson. Okay. 10 years ago, she was the spokesperson of the German Piratenpartei, and later she joined the Greens. She speaks at events as well as in German media about topics such as digital society, democracy, and disinformation. We have also invited her because of your contribution. There she is. Hi, Marina. We have also invited you because your contributions to the public debate are always so clear and inspiring. So, welcome to you, and you'll have a short introduction for us as well.
Hi, good evening. Richard, if the room can hear me fine, can you give me a short thumbs up? Very good. Hi. So thank you for your input, Richard. And yeah, I did have my own research fun with Russian disinformation trolls because I've been born in Ukraine and I've been there during the revolution of 2014. And I have been followed by Russian trolls that did spread disinformation about the Maidan revolution. And I noticed a peculiar thing about them. First of all, they were very aggressive against myself and all journalists who reported from Ukraine to Europe. And they did spread very obvious lies, like photoshops of Hitler hanging in Kiev squares. And I went to these places and took my own photos and fact-checked that information. But what I did was I followed them back. And that was a very interesting journey over the years, because the same accounts that were that said they were Russian-speaking Ukrainians during the revolution, later said they were Germans who were afraid of Syrians during the refugee crisis in 2015. Later still, the same accounts were British people that were for Brexit. And even later, they were Trump voters. And when the invasion started, many of them became Russian-speaking Ukrainians again. And the war was very messy because I remember how I was on the phone with family that lived in Russia, and they were speaking to my Ukrainian family, and they didn't believe that there was an actual war in Ukraine. Like they just didn't believe their own brothers and sisters because they found the television, the Russian television, more convincing. And I was wondering, why is that? Why do people not believe their own families when they believe the TV? And the answer is psychological. They believe the television more because they want to believe the television. There's an emotional need to feel right, to belong to the good guys, or to feel great as a nation. So there are several misconceptions around disinformation that I would like to address. And the first misconception is that people are at the mercy of disinformation where it is spread. But that's not at all the case. There's a second important factor, and that's this emotional need to believe disinformation. People that do not have such an emotional need bypass manipulative mass media and inform themselves independently. And we can see this in countries with free media, where many people bypass it easily and ignore it to find obscure conspiracy theories somewhere that fit into their worldview. People seek out the information they want to believe. And we can block radical channels, and we can and must deplatform Nazis, and we can and must fact check. But these things are all good and do serve a purpose, but they don't change the human need to believe certain lies. Because when the world becomes too complex and then people want to believe stories that supposedly explain and simplify that complexity. Stories in which there are the good guys and the bad guys, and in which you yourself belong to the good guys. And those who feel that they have no control over their own lives feel like, if I don't have any control, somebody must have it. Oh, the elites or the globalists or the Jews. So this is how conspiracy theories are born. And we will not be able to counter this phenomenon through pure regulation. If we want people to engage with information critically and objectively, we need to strengthen something that goes beyond media literacy, namely self-efficacy. That's the feeling of being a responsible, indispensable part of society, and not simply a victim or a consumer, but a creator of one's society. And this means strengthening democratic education, local structures and community support, social programs and welfare, as well as participation. And these things aren't just a luxury when it comes to resilient democratic societies. They're really the basis. And the second misconception is that disinformation is aimed at convincing people that something is true. And many people seem confused that so much of, for instance, Russian disinformation seems so outrageously unbelievable. Like, are we really supposed to believe that Ukraine was building nuclear weapons? No, we weren't. My favorite example is when in 2017, Trump lied about the size of his inauguration crowd, right? An event that we all saw. Journalists were baffled what he was trying to accomplish. And back then I wrote an editorial piece about how that reminds me of the typical propaganda move from the KGB playbook. And Steve Bannon coined this move flooding the zone with shit. And the strategy is to tell so many random lies so loudly that the truth is lost. Like if I say to you, Richard, the sky is green, and you look it up and say, no, the sky is blue. And I differ, no, the sky is green. And you fact check that. You present me with photos and spectrum analysis insisting the sky is blue. And I calmly state, the sky is green. And you get irritated and shout, it's blue, you moron. And I respond, there, no need to be uncivil about this. You think it's blue, I think it's green. We are both entitled to our opinion. And I guess there's no way of knowing which color the sky is. And that is the point. So it's not convincing you that the sky is green, but convincing you that the truth, if there is any, is unknowable. Because if the truth is unknowable, as a democratic society, we have hardly anything to talk about. We can't organize, we can't make decisions, we can't talk if the corona measurements are good or bad, if we can't even agree on whether there is a pandemic, right? So that leaves us in need for an authoritarian figure who will decide what is true and what to do about it. So that's why it's an instrument of authoritarians. And I think besides climate change, one of the main challenges of these following years will be the fight against international authoritarianism and fascism. And we see these movements utilizing both the internet and classical media to flood the zone with shit, because classical media picks up on what 100 Nazi accounts on X will write, and they will retweet each other, and they will be algorithmically pushed. And then there's a trending topic, and all the journalists are on there, and they're like, oh, there's a trending topic. I guess we need to discuss it. And then they'll make a talk show, but you have to invite both sides. So now 100 trolls have captured the attention of statewide media. And for many years, we have tried to counter the fire hose of falsehoods from squirt guns of fact-checking, always reacting, always in defense, and it never really worked. But there has been one moment that gave me a glimmer of hope, and that was when Russia had amassed its army at the Ukrainian border, no invasion yet, and the US security services started preemptively sharing information, and they said they are going to invade. And what that did is it created like a raincoat of expectation against the fire hose of falsehood. The narrative had been set. So when Russia did invade, there was hardly any of this usual confusedness and disbelief. And this seems to me to be the best strategy. Communicate early, communicate transparently, and communicate boldly and clearly. And I think this, together with just becoming a more self-efficient democratic society where voices are not only heard, but also reacted upon, is one of the main tasks that we have to do to counter disinformation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we have to use the microphones now, also for the people watching the live stream. Thank you, Marina. That was really interesting. Maybe we should talk some more about this self-efficacy. I hope I pronounce it well this time, Richard, because he corrected me just an hour before this. In German, it's called Selbstwirksamkeit, Marina. And in Dutch, it's called geloof in eigen kunnen. And it's one of your main points, that is something which we should strengthen. But how can we do that? And should we do it for ourselves? Should we do it for our children? How can we achieve this?
So self-efficacy is the expectation that when I do a thing, something in the world is going to change. So the world can react to my actions. And there is only really one way to gain self-efficacy, and that is just self-efficacy experiences. So what we need to do is to provide possibilities for people, and very especially for children, to gain such experiences, because when children grow, they recognize who they are in society. So when we put them in front of a tablet and just give them mindless YouTube scrolling or later TikTok scrolling, we raise them to be consumers. Or when they go to our inner cities, and you can't literally go anywhere without paying money to be there, to exist as a human being, we are raising consumers. When we give them responsibility and a platform to communicate their needs or to listen to the needs of their peers, to help each other, to organize, to develop their own ideas or to create something, then we are raising creators. And so I think if we want to promote self-efficacy in all people, we need to start in the little places, in the kindergarten, in school, in the workplace, in afternoon groups, volunteer activity, and in the communal space. This is nothing that can be done on a national or European level.
Okay, and one of your points is that to counter disinformation, we have to be transparent and give a lot of, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but we have to be the first with the information and give a lot of information so that we can change the expectancy, if I say it correctly. Richard, what do you think about it? Could that work? Would that be a strategy?
So this is normally called pre-bunking, right? So you're before disinformation narratives circulate, you anticipate them, and you don't debunk them, which is comes after the fact, but you pre-bunk them, which comes before the fact. The tricky part of that, I mean, it's a great idea, but it doesn't really work so well in practice. For fact checkers, for example, what fact checkers have to do, and it's a very interesting field in and of itself, because it's the only kind of journalism that's reactionary. So a story is published, and then you react to it, and you're fact-checking it, and then you're writing a piece that then debunks it. But the piece that you write has to be attached to the original, to the false information, or to the fake news, or to the disinformation. That's also how they get paid, through that link. So in practice, you can't pre-bunk, right? So it's not possible in the kind of, in the journalistic chain, so to speak. But I agree with it. But I'm just introducing a little complication.
Yeah, and your example, Marina, it weren't journalists that pre-bunked. It were the governments, or not? That.
Yeah, it was actually the secret services, and that was a bit unprecedented, but I think a lot of pre-bunking is really just clear communication about what is to come. So I noticed that a lot of democratic governments try to downplay the role of climate change, or downplay the role of many really societal issues that we do have. And if the democratic government doesn't address them, they are still going to come about, but then the right can use them for their narratives. And that is the issue. So it's really all about communicating honestly and addressing the issues that everyone is seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree at all. I mean, but there's a term for this. It's called pre-mediation. It was a term that was coined by the media theorist Richard Gruson, and it was coined in relation to the aftermath of 9/11 and how governments, in particular, sort of prepped or primed audiences so that they could introduce policies that they agreed with, and would then be introduced, and for example, the Iraq War, and so the governmental actions would be, in some sense, a kind of post-production exercise, if you know what I mean.
That doesn't sound like something that we would want to have.
No, exactly. So that kind of that sort of governmental priming or pre-mediation was something that used to be critiqued quite heavily. And so if we could actually use it in a positive way, I mean, this is the first time I've actually heard this point made. It's quite remarkable. I do agree that the U.S. government releasing the intelligence about the impending Russian invasion of Ukraine was smart. But I don't know if we have many other examples. I don't disagree, but I just think pre-mediation, when the government sort of shows you the future, talks about the future in order to implement its policies to make that future come true, sounds quite dangerous to me.
Yeah. Marina? Can you hear us?
No, I don't disagree at all. I just think there are so many clever think tanks on how to manipulate the public, on how to pre-mediate policies, on how to dehumanize whole population groups. People are going really deep into research, and they are building massive online communities to radicalize people. And I just wonder how come this kind of research is never used for good? How come it's never used by actual democratic governments and always just used for war, dehumanization, or disinformation? Why aren't the ministers of the interior, why aren't they having think tanks and psychological research and everything for the goal of strengthening democracies? I don't know. I think it's probably, there's no incentive to do so.
Which brings me to the question, Richard, how is it with the elections now? Because tomorrow we have elections here in the Netherlands, parliamentary elections. And you told me that you weren't contacted this time by the ministry to do such an inquiry into foreign influence, foreign disinformation in these campaigns.
Yeah.
Are you still that hopeful? Because, I mean, in 2019, the mainstream news won, so to say. How is it now, do you think?
So, what's interesting is that there was not a study commissioned to look at the extent to which there is a fake news and or disinformation problem in the run-up to these elections. So this is the first thing that I find kind of interesting. And
Why is that, do you know?
Well, there were other studies. so there were studies, and one was released very recently by the Ministry of Justice, the research arm of the Ministry of Justice, on the rise of the extreme right online, and there's a lot of research about, also commissioned research about how to improve content moderation. So this is the big issue right now. So and fact checking is part of the answer, and there are so many other answers. And I was coincidentally written to today some from the ministry saying, okay, so we need research on that. So it's the research has gone into a different direction, but the problem. It's not necessarily a disinformation problem, in foreign disinformation problem in the Netherlands. There could be. There are a few sources which are dubious, and they seem to be Russian disinformation. I can name them if you want, but
yeah, please.
Like Phoenix is just, and then they constantly change their name just slightly.
Sorry, what did you say?
Phoenix.
Phoenix.
Yeah. This would be one, but anytime you start naming names, so we also, from our study previously, we were faced with a couple of libel lawsuits, defamation lawsuits by organizations because we named them as a problematic source. So maybe that's the last one I'll name. But in any case, so whilst there might not be at least a sort of known Russian disinformation problem in Dutch language social media, political social media, there remains, and I think there remains a domestic problem, and I think it's probably grown larger. And it's a political hot potato, as I said, and people don't want to touch it. People do, but I mean, for governmental commission studies, when we published ours, there was a long discussion. They said, well, Richard, do you have to call it right wing? Mm-hmm. Do you have to actually use that terminology? Can you not make it apolitical somehow? And this was the problem previously.
Disinformation isn't apolitical. Can it be?
No, but they want to avoid the backlash, and so this is the dilemma. This is how I sort of close what I was saying. So what do you call it? How do you create an environment where it can be discussed? Now, Marina's points are very good, right? So this idea of the self-realization and the holistic approach, but. We're not there at the moment, right? So we have a problem, and the question is how to address it, and these sorts of studies want to depoliticize that problem it's a debatable point, right? So others want to like hyper politicize it, for example.
Yeah. Well, I asked around a bit, and. Our impression is also that there's not a lot of disinformation around our political campaigns at the moment. I think, Marina, the situation in Germany is quite different. Maybe you can tell us some more about that, because I think Russian influence in Germany is all over the place.
Yeah, so there is a lot of German-speaking disinformation going around, and there is a lot of meddling from Russia in particular as foreign actors. But we do have a huge domestic problem. And the problem is, as in many countries right now, a very stark divisiveness in politics, with the right-wing AfD on one side and everyone else on the other side. While we see that the Conservatives are keeping their options open to collaborate with the AfD. So there's a huge shift right now that makes many people very afraid. And we see that we've been seeing it actually for 10 years, that the right wing and the mainstream do not read the same newspapers. They do not watch the same shows. There's a media division. In Germany, almost all voters of all parties read very similar newspapers. So there is no crass division between right-wing and left-wing and conservative readers. It's not that stark as it is, for instance, in the USA. But the voters of the AfD, they have a distinctly different media consumption, and they have distinctly different online spaces. And what is one of the main problems right now, I don't know how it is in the Netherlands, but with Musk's buying of Twitter, Twitter was a very, very important platform for journalists and politicians alike. It was like a press center for main media coverage, and it's still quoted like a usual source, but it's actually just a haven for right-wingers right now, where any reasonable voices and fact checkers are algorithmically silenced. And it has a very dangerous influence on our mass media landscape, because German mass media tends to go from one problem of the week to the next, and copies a lot of talking points from the right without often addressing the main issues the country actually has.
Yeah, you have left Twitter yourself, haven't you? And you are also calling for all journalists and everyone else in the media to ignore Twitter. I find, ever since you said that, I noticed how often Twitter is cited by mainstream media, and in that manner stays influential. Although we all know that it's an extreme right-wing channel at the moment.
Yeah, the truth is, if you wouldn't quote Truth Social or Parler or any other fringe right-wing media platform, you shouldn't quote Twitter. But that's something that many journalists have not realized yet. And I think it's just so dangerous that the mainstream always moves 2 steps behind the right wing. So the right wing always initiates conversation, and then there's always a reaction. And I think the main thing that lacks in the German discourse, but I follow the British and American discourse a bit, is a proactive vision or action by the mainstream, by the democratic government, by people who aren't right-wing, addressing the issues that are on the table. Because I think a lot of disinformation works because people intuitively feel something that is correct. And that is that democracy in its current form is not the best equipped to deal with the issues we have today. Because there is an actual lack in the system. But the only alternative we are presented with is authoritarianism. And it's not incidental that most disinformation, most fake news are right-wing, are authoritarian. It's in the nature of the game. And I don't look for more left-wing disinformation. I look for more truth in public communication. I think that would be more effective than just constant debunking, constant running after the right, constant reacting to the challenges they present.
Yeah. No.
Can I add
Of
something?
course.
But we should continue to fact check, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm not against that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I find it an interesting sort of dilemma for the fact checkers. There seems to be so much this misinformation, fake news, false news, and it seems to be also read by a particular audience or public, very different audience or public that would then read the fact checks. There seems to be also this divided media ecology of the misinformation on the one hand and the fact checks on the other hand. It's another divide. So it seems to me that there's that additional sort of immediate problem as well. And do you feel, or I mean, are there arguments to be made to try to reach the public that consumes the disinformation? Or do we just, sort of leave that be and try to, grow the citizenry and the sort of healthy media? I mean, should we address the problem, or should we just let it stew?
I don't think those are the only two alternatives.
Sure, yeah, of course.
So
do both.
Psychologically, people do not like to be corrected on their worldview. They have a tendency to protect it. Even us, right? Every one of us, we struggle towards keeping our worldview intact. So when we are presented with evidence to the contrary, we often go into something that psychologists call reactance. So we close our mind, we are defensive. And that goes for me as well as for every conspiracy theorist out there. And that is why fact-checking most of the time doesn't work, because people who are being fact-checked on their worldview tend to believe even more the conspiracy theory. So my experience from talking with my racist relatives, of which I have a lot, even though they are all immigrants and all Jews, is that I don't discuss racism with them. When I try to talk some sense into them, I never speak about the issues they try to speak about. I usually go like, how are you? How was the pandemic for you? I heard you struggled. How did you cope? And that is an approach that does not let them stew in their conspiracy theories, because I do address them, but I do not address their conspiracy theories. I address them as people. I address their needs. I address their need for social acceptance, their need for happiness, universal needs that all people share. Their need to be needed. And they tend to become less racist as a result, even though I did not mention racism with one word. So that goes for conspiracy theories, that goes for most disinformation. People seek out the information they want to hear, and that's why fact-checking seldom reaches them, but people do. And of course, it only works with your family, your friends. On a mass media scale, I imagine it would work if, I don't know, we would talk more about how expensive it's become to live and what to do about it. Because that's the how are you equivalent in politics.
Richard, one of your recommendations is to facilitate public debates about the topics that are very controversial and out there for a long time, like, for example, a black peat. I don't know if you know what that is, Marina, black peat. Our Sinterklaas tradition, that is, very disputed in the Netherlands. Could that be, I mean, are you on the
Say
same...
debate.
How do you say
no,
it?
but there's a. So this is a subject matter which I think is very tricky, and what I was looking at was the very long and deep Dutch history of what's called the brede maatschappelijke discussie. Sometimes it is indeed called debate, but this is this approach which is very typical in the Netherlands, but also other countries to the north, where you're trying to build some form of consensus.
Do you mean what we know as burgerraden?
Those as well. There are many of these.
Burgerräte, you have them in Germany as well.
There are many of these experiments over the last sort of 40 years, and the consensus conferences, things like this, and we haven't seen any of those sorts of experiments in the last, I don't know, 5-10 years, and I don't know where they have gone to, but I thought I would try to revive them. So this was what I was this is what I was doing with that point.
Marina, what's your view on this? On that, could that work, like burgerraten, or sort of organizing dialogue? Maybe, dialogue is better than debate. Yeah. So organize dialogue on topics?
Definitely. So many people say, oh, with disinformation rampant, we can't have more democratic participation because, by God, do you really trust these people with participation? And my answer is yes, definitely. So democratic participation can come to really, really stupid results. See Brexit. But that is because the wrong tools are used. And I like to categorize political problems into 4 different kinds of problems for which there are different tools. So we have the problems that are very complicated and unemotional. And for these, we have the parliament. It's their job to learn all the complicated stuff, do the governance. It's fine. We have delegates for that. There are the problems that are highly complicated, but also very emotional. See climate change, or in Ireland, there was the issue of abortion or same-sex marriage. And there the Bürgerräte really shine because they give a random group of people that has been randomly selected, so it could have been me, real power, but also time and resources to in-depth discuss an issue. And when they came up with solutions in Ireland, it had an amazingly huge acceptance for such a Catholic country because people felt represented. Then there's problems that are very emotional but trivial. They aren't very complicated at all, but they concern all people, and that for that, direct democracy is best. And then there are very simple but also unemotional issues, and we could use liquid democracy for that. So the democratic spectrum of participation is really huge, and we are using a fraction of it right now. But the most important part, many of the Bürgerräte in Germany recently didn't work at all because they weren't binding. They just didn't do anything. You know, the Rat shared their suggestions, and the politicians nodded along and said, okay, thank you, we'll put it with the other papers here. And it never came up again. So I think this kind of pseudo-participation is worse than no participation at all, because it builds frustration. It shows me, oh, I did a thing, but the world did not change. And that's the opposite of self-efficacy, right? So the more I act as if I let people participate, the worse my population becomes. The more I speak with my population as if they are adults and clever people, the more they will behave as such.
I hope that's true. I see that it's 9 o'clock, so and we want to have some time for the audience to ask their questions. Are there any questions in the audience at the moment?
I have a methodological question. If you categorize information in a particular category, like mainstream, junk, false information, etc., all these categories that you have mentioned, how do you check your categorization? Do you, for instance, take a particular piece of news or a opinion, and then you have to categorize it to make your beautiful graphs? But do you have them checked, for instance, by one person or by a group or by 3 persons? Do you have some sort of validation methodology put into this whole job of categorizing information?
Let me first check, Marina. I don't think you can hear the question from the audience.
Not really well, I'm afraid.
So I will shortly summarize it. It's for Richard, and it's about the category. Oh, difficult word. Of fake news sources. Yeah. So, Richard.
Yeah. So, I mean, in our study, we used the sort of intercoder reliability. So we had multiple people look at the same sources and see whether they coded them the same. So this is, and when one does that, you're trying to reach a sort of intercoder reliability score of, 78, 80, something around that. I mean, and there's a particular kind of term that's used, or score or metric that's used, which we didn't actually use, but that one often uses it. It's called the Krippendorf alpha. So this is the gold standard of intercoder reliability. But so we did this one time, but normally when we do this kind of work, we actually don't do the categorization of sources ourselves, but rather we use the categorizations of others. And when you're doing English language sources, there are some meta sources that are quite good at that. And one is called NewsGuard. Another one that's pretty good is called Media Bias Fact Check, although that some people argue that that's not as reliable as it could be. But in any case, you can also triangulate those, right? And so you can look at how these meta sources that are in the business of categorizing media in terms of quality or in terms of their politics. You can triangulate those, and that would be the technique that I would recommend. But indeed, it's a tortured game because we were doing it on a story by story basis rather than on a general source level. It was per story. And then you'll notice quite quickly that certain stories you might categorize as one thing, but other stories in the same source you wouldn't categorize it as such. So when you begin to aggregate it to the source, you get some mismatches. You get in trouble. You see. So there are any number of complications in that.
Any questions? Where's the microphone? Oh, it's coming.
Thanks a lot for a very intriguing discussion here. So I want to get a little bit of a reaction from the point of view of let's say the participation in the democratic processes is becoming more and more time consuming. Like people are already busy with their 9-to-5 jobs. There are lots of social anxiety, inflation. And at the end of the day, then we are asking them to sit down and try to go through the fake news and educate themselves about, for us, perhaps it's a daily business. We are in this game. But what can be done to increase the participation of normal people? Because the number of media sources are increasing constantly, there's always a new media cycle, and it just becomes exhausting to continue to participate as a layman person in this process. Is that a factor in these considerations? We can come up with the next best solution, but if the normal person on the street is exhausted, then their participation might be limited in this process. I just want to get a bit of reaction if that's a concern, and what can we do about that?
And from Richard or from Marina?
If possible, both.
Okay.
Thank you.
Did I understand the question correctly, that it's about how to get exhausted normal people to get to participate?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
that's correct.
So exhaustion is absolutely part of a status quo preserving system. I played a dictator once in a role-playing game, and I did invent a hyper bureaucracy just so people didn't have time for a revolution because they were so busy filling out forms. But the thing is, people have a lack of energy is usually a question of priorities. And people all really want the same things. They want to be happy, they want to be needed, and they want social contact. That is baseline people priorities. So when I realized that participating in my society rather than just passively consuming stuff, going from work to TV and back to work, if I realize that participating makes me happier, then I will do it. And I will have the energy because it will give energy back. But it's not every form of participation, of course. When I talk about political participation, like writing letters to your representatives or, I don't know, voting on issues, that doesn't give me a lot of energy or fulfillment. And that doesn't really grow my self-efficacy. So the kind of participation that I would suggest for people who are tired, who just want to live, because there are so many nicer things than politics, participate only a little and really start with your neighbors. Direct help is the minimal form of participation. So when I knock at my neighbor's door and I say, hey, I cooked a lot of soup, do you want some? Or do you need someone to watch your children this weekend? Because I was planning to go to the zoo. That is something that makes them happier, obviously, but it also makes you happier because now you are not just living there, you are a part of a community. And we all want to be part of a community. Or when I go to a park and I say, I really miss benches here, and I do something to get the park to have benches. Every time I walk past these benches, it's part of my park. And it's a very different feeling of being there, not just as a visitor, as a stranger, but as something that I did myself. So for instance, my daughter and I, we just conquered part in our street around the tree where there's no asphalt. We planted flowers there, and it was our little garden. And the neighbors walked by and they asked what we're doing. And my daughter excitedly told them everything about it. And they said, cool, I have a chili plant. Can I plant it there? And I said, yeah, sure. And then we made plans on how to water the plants. And suddenly I knew my neighbors' names. And now we're not just anonymous cohabitants of this high-rise building. We are an actual community that has a little garden. It's very sad, but it's a garden. And I think this is the kind of participation that I would encourage people to do, because in the beginning it seems like it costs energy and I don't feel like it, and I would have to dress, and I don't really like to talk to strangers. But in the end of the day, it makes us more mentally healthy, and it makes us healthy as a society. And social contact makes us more resilient against division and disinformation and populism.
I would like to react in a very, very different way. But I agree very much with Marina. But there's a couple of not underlying assumptions, but maybe something implicit in what you said that I'd like to address, and that is that these sort of publics or consumers or audiences for media sort of need training. Maybe they do, but when we say that, we're sort of assuming or implying or that they that they're being duped, or that they're being tricked, or that they're being manipulated. When we can also think of media consumers as, that as kind of active. They're active audiences also, who are constantly actively. This is a classic. This is in fact television studies. The television studies people were here before we were this evening. That they're constantly decoding what it is that they're seeing. They're constantly in their own way. They're not just taking it in. They're actively interpreting and reinterpreting and placing and sorting and so the audiences are active. This is one thing, but the other thing that's the other sort of insight from this is more from communication studies, is that it's very hard to influence people through media, even through advertising. It's a slightly controversial point, but it's been found, study after study, that if you try to sort of change someone's opinion on something through like a political advert or something, that it's very, very hard to do so. That they are not completely set in their ways, but it's very, very difficult to sort of change or influence. So these are kind of two things that we always have to take into account when we start thinking about training or education or media literacy or things along these lines. That there are a couple of assumptions: the active audience and the non-influenceable, that are oftentimes thought of as constants.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, I see one.
Thank you. Hey there, thanks you both for your insights in this discussion today. So I was just wondering about the point that was highlighted on more organized discourse and dialogues around issues globally, universally, that need to be discussed. How would you recommend people being empowered to organize such discussions? Which stakeholders need to be involved? And how can we make sure that these are not only effective and efficient discussions and dialogues, but also inclusive?
Did you hear the question, Marina? I have to repeat it.
Only a bit. Could you repeat it, please?
It's about the dialogues and how you could organize that, and which stakeholders you have to involve. And the other part, do you remember, Richard? Help me out.
How we can make it effective. Oh, sorry.
How we can make it
effective, efficient, and inclusive.
Effective, efficient, and inclusive.
Mm-hmm. So that's the issue. When you try to involve all relevant stakeholders, you usually don't involve all relevant people, because for most problems like the ones that we discussed today, it's really all people, because the goal is to make a democracy really inclusive. So that means the stakeholders are children and pensioners and people of all walks of life. And there is really two formats that can facilitate a discussion among all people. And the first is a group of representatives, and I think this group would have to be randomly chosen. So absolutely randomized group, absolutely including children, because these voices of children, of marginalized people, of disabled people are so often completely unheard. So we are missing parts of society, very important parts that can give very, very important insights. And the second thing is mass media, which is a vehicle for mass deliberation, if you will. But our mass media, and I include the Netherlands and German, is not very diverse. Even though it really tries to be, it's still overrepresentative for certain people and very underrepresentative for others. And I really believe that social media would be a vehicle to make marginalized voices heard. I really believed in that. Yeah, it kind of did, but it connected marginalized people, but it also connected Nazis who then targeted marginalized people. So not really a win. But I think more inclusive mass media would be one step, and a more federal approach. So we don't always have to discuss everything in a central place, on a federal level, on a national level. I think we need to strengthen the autonomy of smaller communities, of communes, of cities, of streets, bring people together there and have them discuss. And I think if a whole street would discuss the Zwarte Piet problem, they would come to conclusions that they wouldn't have on their own, because this back and forth is what opens our minds. But it needs to be with people that we normally don't discuss things with. So we need places, third places, where people meet. And this could be like a library that's together with the local university, and an open cafe where you can bring your own drinks. And it's really open, where people can just, meet and do their own projects and repair stuff. And they have a sewing machine there, and they can come into contact. I think that's the most important step there.
I think that was very eloquent. I don't know if I have too much to add, but I do have maybe three quick points. So the first is that I think we should look to existing convivial spaces, and these can be online, and these can be offline. So these are these third spaces, as Marina put it. But a lot of the deliberative participatory tradition, creates these sort of new kind of artificial constructs, and I think we should look for existing convivial spaces where some form of deliberation can take place. So this is the first point. The second point is I also like this the idea of more agility. Sort of that there's a social issue that arises that we can then take it on in these convivial spaces, but in a like quickly, in an agile framework. Yeah, but I mean, just be quite flexible and agile, and so that you can begin the deliberation quite quickly, and then the third point, and this is something that is oftentimes used for the development of new technologies, and this is the kind of the Scandinavian tradition of the participatory design, where it's quite open, and it's open to participation. It's open-ended to what will actually come out of it. So there is the respect for the process, which can lead to all sorts of different sort of solutions. It's a Scandinavian participatory design tradition, which I think that's oftentimes applied to for new technologies, but I think can work quite well for these democratic political deliberative processes.
Well, I come to my last difficult question. I think maybe you have answered it already, because my question, I don't want you to leave depressed tonight, but I don't think that will be the case, because you had so many good smaller and bigger solutions. But what should you and I do today to save democracy? Maybe Marina first. Is there something we can do now, tomorrow?
Can you please repeat the question?
What can you and I do today, or maybe tomorrow, to save democracy, or to make a contribution to saving democracy?
Oh, I'm doing my OLA project, where I work with students in schools, and they can participate and make their school their own place, and they have power, and they have so many beautiful ideas. And every day when I work, I'm convinced the youth is really fine. They're good people.
Do you have an example of what kind of solutions it's about? How I understand it is that they can decide on how things work at school? Or?
Yes, they can. They decide on their rules. They have an app, and they can put in their own ideas. And if everyone wants a hamster, but Susie is allergic to hamsters, then they discuss what minorities are and why minority protection matters. And they learn to compromise, and they learn to discuss and to say what's important and why it's important to them. And I think by teaching such basic democratic skills, we can do so much more to strengthen democracies, because, you know, the alt-right are not the only ones working on the future.
Thank you. Richard.
Well, I mean, this is a timely question, right? So tomorrow, what are we going to do? Vote. So this is something obvious, but I also like the idea of sort of the tradition of bringing along people with you to vote. I mean, it's an interesting how sort of block voting sort of historically was one way of empowering marginalized groups, and it was something that was practiced and then was hijacked actually by the sort of like political machines of specifically of the right in a few American cities in the late 19th century. But prior to that, the sort of block voting was something really key. We can do it in a smaller way, you know, sort of like in the neighborly way that Marina proposed recently. Take along your neighbors with you. So this is what we can do tomorrow.
Good idea. Thank you very much. And thank you to the online viewers and the audience here for being here. And have a nice trip home. Thank you.